I'm Mark Wood. I've been doing polar expeditions for over 20 years. I'm here today to answer your questions. This is Polar Exploration Support. So Adrian Jones, 28, asked what was the most repulsive thing you had to eat on your expeditions. It was rancid whale blubber, which is absolutely repulsive and just was really tough to chew through as well. And the people who gave it me, who knew me really well, were smiling because they knew it tasted bad. When you chew it, it's like chewing on a car tyre, but it also stinks. So Troy P. Simpson asks, I've no idea why I'm watching videos about what to do if I come face to face with a polar bear. Well, I've come face to face with a polar bear, Troy, and 300 meters away, right up close to my face, actually followed me for about 3 days. But the moment that I started to feel my heart really beat was when I actually could smell the bear. And that means the bear's really, really close. And I could hear him sort of grunting. So this is the nose of the polar bear. I was stood on some ice, luckily, and he jumped up and sniffed my GoPro camera. To give it perspective, he was an arm's distance away, so he was this close away from me, which is too close in my world. And this is kind of what I was looking at. The incredible strength within this jaw to rip an animal open was only at, an arm's length away. It's the first time that I've actually felt real danger. And you only feel tremendously alone when you feel you need somebody's help. And I had nobody else there. It seemed like hours, but it was seconds of looking at this bear. And eventually he dropped down and just walked away. And at that point, I got this pen with the firework on the end, and I pointed it at his feet, and luckily it exploded in front of him, not harming the bear, but enough to scare him away, and he ran off. But for about 2 or 3 nights, I was still sticking my head out the tent like a meerkat and looking around and making sure that he'd gone, and he had definitely gone, which was a massive relief. So Sirius GF says, bro, where is the North Pole? Actually, there's 5 North Poles. Let me show you. So this is the top of the world, and you've got Russia and you've got Canada and all the countries around, but the blue bit in the center is the Arctic Ocean. To show you where the 5 North Poles are, I'm going to use my trusty polar bear claw. You've got the geographic North Pole, which is the very top of the planet where all of the lines of longitude pass through. That's a fixed pole. Then you've got the pole of inaccessibility, which is on the Arctic Ocean itself, again a fixed point, but it's equidistant from any landmass around it, from Greenland to Canada to Russia, etc. Then you've got 3 other poles. One of them is the geomagnetic North Pole, which all geophysicists like, very difficult word to say, and that's a moving pole, and currently it's going across the Canadian island of Ellesmere. Then you've got the magnetic North Pole, which I'm sure you've heard of, and that's going across the Canadian Ocean side, and it's crossing over to Russia. So it's moving and moving over to the Russian side, and that's really in the news at the moment because of its shift. And the final pole that you've got is actually in the air itself. It's the point from Polaris to the North Pole, and it's a celestial pole. So that's 5 North Poles. So a great question or statement from Snakes L1, the dudes that were involved in the heroic age of Arctic exploration were out of their friggin' minds. So the pioneer age of polar exploration were really from the late 1800s onwards, right up to the point we reached the geographic North and geographic South Poles, which were earlier on in the last century. At that time, it was about discovery and mapping these areas. In the days of Sir Ernest Shackleton and his men doing epic journeys across Antarctica, some would say that they risked their lives for discovery, but really it was pure survival. So they weren't given a choice. They went out there to do something that no other humans had done before, which was so heroic. Nowadays, that wouldn't really happen because the communications we have, the global communications, the satellites, etc., would allow us to show the peril in real time so we could be rescued. Arma Kohlsberg has written, read today that the Arctic explorers brought lard with them since it's so calorifically dense. Did they just eat it or what? That's what the explorers used to do. Nowadays, we're a little bit more advanced in understanding nutrition, and this picture shows little packets of food that I've decanted from the original packet. There's actually about 100 packets of food, and you've got main meals and also puddings, and that allows me also to put salami and butter and cheese and salt and everything else in there, and you wrap it up into a little ball. Instead of having a big carrier bag full of food each day, there's actually 2 handfuls of food that you have. And inside there is apple and custard powder, and that's what I eat as a pudding. You've also got the main meals on this side, which can be a mixture of curries, stews, pastas as well, for different packets, so you're not eating the same food all the time. I go and collect the snow or the ice, and I melt it down, then boil it up, and then I pour this powder into a container and pour the boiling hot water into the container, mix it up, and then it expands. And that's what I eat. Full of protein, full of carbs, full of everything you need to perform really well. Anderson Lemke asks a good question. What kind of cell phones do Arctic explorers use? With cell phones, we can't use them in these extreme cold areas. We use satellite phones, and you can't use them as well like normal cell phones to look at the internet and to connect with friends or say call emergency services. We use these to connect directly with the rescue services that we've already connected with prior to the expedition. I can also connect with friends and family, but I don't when I'm on extreme expeditions. And the reason being is it's too emotional for me. To bring myself back into their world will drain my sort of build up of non-emotion that I've got for the expedition. It loses my focus for what I'm doing each day, which is pretty tough mentally. So I don't need somebody that I love on the other end of the phone, weakening that spirit, if you like. So this is a question from Al Lowe. What's the difference between the North Pole and the South Pole? All of the difference in the world, he says. So from an explorer's perspective, the Arctic Ocean or the North Pole is the toughest expedition you can do, hands down. Antarctica itself being a continent, all you have to deal with is oncoming winds, tremendous cold, the loneliness of being out there, and sometimes crevasses, but you generally know where the crevasses are. In the north, it's like a zoo up there. There's a varied amount of animals there. If you move to Antarctica, in the center around the South Pole, there's no birds or anything like that. It's just silence. So Sarah Bushway asks, watching season 7 of Alone, they have to survive 100 days in the Arctic by themselves to win $1 million. Could you do it? I'd love to win $1 million with what I do. For me personally, I work alone a lot. So I'm known for solo work, working in Antarctica, the Arctic Circle, also on training expeditions as well. So I'll spend 50 days in Antarctica alone, 30 days around the North Pole, another 30 days in the Norwegian High Arctic. Generally, I'm okay being alone. And the biggest issue there is the mental status and strength that you require to do that. And I think experience gives you the abilities to carry that out. And as you're going through a blank landscape, it gives you tremendous creativity in your mind to think about yourself as a human being, but what direction you want to go in life as well. So Be the Spark has asked a serious question. Other than reindeer and the occasional polar bear, what kind of animals would live in Santa's North Pole? You've got Arctic fox, Arctic hares, which are small animals, obviously. You've also got caribou, which is a reindeer, and you've got muskox, which are quite big animals, pack animals. And also you've got lemmings, very, very small. And the only real bird I can think of would be the Arctic tern, which is in fact the longest migrating bird on the planet and can also be found in Antarctica as well. So it goes all the way around the planet. It's very rare, but sometimes you do get interaction with these animals. So Andy C1 asks, which polar explorer do you have the most admiration for and why? So 2 big explorers, Sir Ernest Shackleton and Robert Falcon Scott, did epic expeditions in Antarctica. But there was one person who has actually worked with them, is like a shadow of these 2 men, and it's an Irishman called Tom Crean, and he was the workforce behind them and is known as the unsung hero of that age. So it was in Tom Crean's nature to survive, but also to look after the people he was with. So he put his life in danger by actually rescuing his men, looking after Shackleton, being the forefront or the energy behind making that expedition to the South Pole a success, as in all the men survived. Rudy Schuller asks, what do negative degree temperatures feel like? To stand alone in -40, -50 is a real tenseness on your body, almost claustrophobic, that you can't get out of the situation. It's a real horrible feeling that you're engulfed in the cold. But to survive in that moment, you need to do three things. One is you need to make sure your body core temperature is warm. So by eating food is a real survival technique to warm yourself up from the inside. The second thing is to wear the correct clothing, and that's something that will help you keep warm but also allow your body to breathe as you're moving, so you don't create sweat on your body, because if you create sweat, then when you stop, that will turn to ice, will cling onto your heart and your lungs and can give you hypothermia. And then the third thing is movement. So as long as you can move, keep moving, keep the blood flowing around the body away from the extremities so you don't get frostbite, then your body can function and you can progress. So inside the tent itself at night, it's the same temperature as outside the tent. You've got a little protection from the wind, which is good, but it can be -35 within inside the tent, which is colder than your freezers at home. But any explorer, any adventurer that you ever meet, and you say the sound of the cooker is, as soon as you start hearing that sound, your brain starts getting happy because your body starts warming up. And it's amazing to feel that initial heat coming off the cooker, where you start stripping your clothes down and you can actually be in base layers inside your tent as the tent heats up. So Maiden Slate asks, curious, how would you envision medical care in remote and rural areas? And I am self-sufficient. So I need to first of all be trained in medical care myself. In Antarctica, as I started to move towards the South Pole over 50 days, I had a problem with my boot. It wasn't fitting very well with my skis, so I had a little bit of movement inside with my foot. And over a few days, it started to heat up. And one day I took my foot out and I found at the base of my foot, the skin had come off, a massive amount of skin had come off. And you just had the rawness of the skin underneath. And I was in a lot of agony. So what I did at night was I cut the skin off. And because skin's got protein in it, I ate the skin. I didn't eat the skin. That's a joke, by the way. I took the skin off. After a few days, it actually dried off, because Antarctica is a dry desert. If you expose the foot to the dryness, it dries really, really quickly. So the environment actually saved the day for me. So this is from original LHRN. I think I need a career change. I wondered how one becomes an Arctic explorer. I think you just need to find where your passion lies and what you want to do, and just take steps from there. The word explorer is quite a contentious word in this modern era. I've been asked whether I can actually call myself that. Well, after 35 plus expeditions in the polar regions, I feel I have a right to say that, and also it excites children when I come into schools to give talks, that they know that I've got an explorer coming in. Really, the explorers that I recognize are these guys in the past, the pioneers who discovered areas on the planet and in space. They are the pioneer explorers of the past. The key point is you've got to have the desire to go out there, because the environment is so claustrophobic and unpredictable that you've got to have the real need to go out there and operate. So you've got to consider that to begin with. So my suggestion would be to go out and experience the environment to begin with, and then to decide how you want to operate out there. Lime LA Cowboy, I love polar exploration, because where else are you going to find this many people excited to discover a guy who got cannibalized 180 years ago? That's a good statement, and yeah, people are excited about the macabre, aren't they? 100 or so years ago, in the days of Sir John Franklin and his men, who perished along the Northwest Passage in high Arctic Canada, weren't discovered until recent times, as ships weren't. But all of the men died on ice. There was talks of cannibalism as well. And this is the human nature at its rawest. And really, the only reason we know about this is because of the diaries left behind and the historic value of the whole expedition itself. And that just shows how harsh these guys were living. If you have to resort to something like that, it's just hell on earth. So Arianas has asked how to travel to the Arctic. You can pull sledges like I do, carry everything with you. You can go on snowmobiles with teams. You can also go on dog teams, which I love doing in Alaska. I've worked with really good dog teams out there called Squid Dog Acres. So these little blue bits of material are actually booties for dogs to put on their feet. So these dogs have actually run in these. This was one of the main transports back in the day for dog teams to transport humans across the ice. And it's still used today in high Arctic areas, but not in Antarctica. They're not allowed dogs in Antarctica anymore because it's unnatural for dogs to be there. But it is a main source of transport for the polar regions. So aside from pulling sledges, we also wear skis and we go backcountry skiing. So we have the bindings which are not attached to the ski itself with the whole foot, it's just attached by the toe. It allows you to pivot and push the ski along. So we do this as we're pulling the sledges along. It allows us to propel ourselves a greater distance using less energy. So I do extreme expeditions, but the polar regions are accessible to anybody to go and venture into. You just need to travel with the right company. Devon Flaherty has asked me about the third man factor. Has anybody ever experienced the third man factor? When I did the South Pole, I crossed there for 50 days without any music, anything to stimulate my brain. But after a while, as I started to approach the South Pole itself, it's on a plateau of 3,000 meters. And I started to push up this plateau and I was in quite a bit of pain. My body was folding a little bit. I was really pushing against the wind as I was going forward. So it's an horrendous time for me. And at that point, I felt an arm around my shoulder. I was alone. I felt somebody gripping onto my shoulder and somebody leaning into me, whispering words of encouragement, keep going, keep going, keep going. And that allowed me to almost be quite zen. And even though I felt really relaxed as I was pushing forward, my mind was clearer. My body was still probably struggling, but I didn't feel it inside. And it felt great. And that happened about 6 or 7 times on that expedition. And when I called for it, it never happened. When I got back to Canada, I spoke to a great explorer up there and said, this is what happened, because I was a little bit embarrassed as well. And he said that it happened to him on the way back from the North Pole when they tried to find this food area which they'd laid out on ice. They'd lost it, so they did a pattern search and something was telling him to go over towards the left. And as he walked 100 yards, he found the food in the ice. I'm sure scientists would say that you're a lowest ebb and your mind was thinking that you had no other choice and I needed support, so it manifested this support that I required. My mum died 10 years prior to that, so I could easily relate it to maybe it's the spirit of my mother coming through. And a lot of people might do that and I wouldn't smile at that or joke about it. It's one of the two. I'd like to think it's my mum, but who knows? So See the Universe has asked, if you could bring one animal back from the North Pole to be a pet, what would you choose and why? And the bad news they're giving me is penguins don't live in the North. Thanks for that. I didn't really know that. If you're asking me what's my favourite animal and maybe a cuddly toy version of it, then I would definitely bring back a lemming, because it's very small, it's very cute, and it's very easy to hide away in my house away from people who think a 58-year-old man shouldn't have a teddy bear. So Licensed Clown asks, what if I went to work in the Arctic? I feel like that would be cool. It would be. How many people can say they did that? I can talk about the Canadian high Arctic, which is probably half the size of Europe with a human population of about 500 people. There's 2 settlements, Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay, which have about 270 to 300 people in. And then there's a few research centres around a vast area, which makes the numbers up to between 400 and 500 people. However, there's also polar bears roaming around that area, so the polar bear population really outweighs the human population. So Cora asks, how does one prepare for an exploration to the Arctic? And I think that to answer this is in preparation. There's many things you have to pack for a polar expedition, but the top 5 things that I would recommend are these. Sleeping bag is essential for a good night's sleep. Sleep is so important to how you perform the next day. A great tent. You need something which will withstand storms and keep you protected from the wind. A great cooker. Something which will be reliable through the 50, 100 days. And then the 4th thing is your navigation. And the final thing is, if I was going to drop all 4 of those and just pick one thing, it would be a location beacon. And if we don't take that with us, I think it's foolhardy. So to take a navigational system with you, to track where you're going, and then to press it in your hour of need is so important, because the success of an expedition is coming home safe and sound. I don't really take books or anything like that because they're too heavy. I take a little iPod with me with music on it and some podcasts on there as well. But also I take a dictaphone, because I'm not great at writing things down as the pioneers used to do, write great diaries. So I actually sew it into my sleeping bag. And at night when I've had something to eat and I'm nice and warm, tucked in my sleeping bag, and it's the wind's blowing outside and it's tremendously cold, I can sit in my sleeping bag and talk about the day and talk about how I feel, which I think is really important for people to listen to. What are your biggest fears? The cold, the natural predators, or the isolation? What draws humans to visit the Arctic, and how can one visit the Great North and leave it untouched? For me, the biggest fear on exploration isn't polar bears, isn't the cold, it's the fear of giving in. It's the fear of that moment where you find a weakness within your body and your heart and you say, I can't go on. And the trigger that keeps you going is the fact you truly believe in what you're doing, and also you have the mental knowledge to know that it will get better, you will progress, and you will get to your destination in the end. So when I was in Antarctica, the plane did disappear and I was left on my own, and I knew I had 50 days in front of me to reach the geographic South Pole. I'd spent 3 years preparing for this and telling everybody I was going to do it. So I had the weight of the world, if you like, upon my shoulders as I moved forward. But 5 days into the journey, I lost a key element to my expedition, which was my music. Little iPod that I took with me. I lost it in the ice, and yes, it was a white iPod that I lost. So I had absolutely nothing to think about but my own thoughts, and the silence and looking around 360 of nothing actually played on my mind, to the point where I pitched my tent middle of the day and I sat in it and I thought, I can't do this anymore. This was 5 days into the journey, and I spent 36 hours in that tent just going through my mind of giving in all the time. I know I'm an older man, but I can be honest to you and say that I cried, and I judged myself and what I was doing. And at that point, I got on my satellite phone. I phoned my friend back in the UK who knew me really well. And I said, I want to give in. And he talked me through what was wrong, how I could process things. He talked me back on my feet, but he didn't make me move my feet. So I packed everything away, then I stood looking at the path in front of me, and I just put 1 foot in front of the other, 1 foot in front of the other. Kept on doing that for another 1,000 feet, and that's how I reached the South Pole, by just basically moving myself in the right direction. Remember, Sarah asks a good question: how was the golden age of Arctic exploration possible before hot hands? Which is what I want to know. Hot hands is like a pad that you can have in your hand. You break it and it warms up your hands. They're great if you're going skiing or if you're doing stuff like operating cameras and things like that. But for what I do, I try not to use artificial heat. It's a very short-term thing. It feels great at the time, then that's taken away and I'm back to being cold again. It helps in sense of emergencies, but I don't generally use them just to warm myself up. You've got to remember, they didn't have these pads, but what they did bring on their ships were things like musical instruments, like pianos and guitars, and they had bottles of whiskey and wine and rum and all these different foods on the ship, and then they transported that to the ice, and they took a lot of heavy equipment along with them. So even though they didn't have the comfort of hot hands, they had the comfort of other things that we take for granted in normal life. So Tamsin VR asks, how cold is it right now? Do we need to dress like Arctic explorers? So you don't just put big jackets on. You have very, very thin layers that you wear that are breathable, that trap air, and you can have 2 or 3 of those on, depending on how cold you are. And then you have a mid layer on top. And then if you're really, really cold, like if you're static and not using your body to generate heat, then you can put a big down jacket on, zip it right up with your hat and everything to keep you nice and warm. But it all depends on what you're doing. If you're moving, then your body will generate heat. If you're static, then you will release heat from your body, so you need to contain it. When you're in a tent at night and you're about to get into your -40 sleeping bag, so really great sleeping bags you need, the mistake a lot of people make is they think, I'm really cold, so they wear all their jackets and everything, and they get into the sleeping bag and they start to freeze. And the reason for that is because the sleeping bag is designed to contain the heat of the body. So you heat up the bag doesn't heat up you. So to wear less clothing in a sleeping bag is the important thing to do. What I do is I get into my sleeping bag, and when it's freezing cold, I do a little jog. I move around quite a lot and I generate a lot of heat. Then I put the bag up, zip it up, and all that heat is then dispersed inside the bag, and that's how you keep warm. So this is from Walter. How are igloos built and how do they keep you warm? Igloos are built in igloo shape because it gives strength to the structure. If it just had walls, then it'd be difficult to build a structured roof to it. Also, the ice that is used has got very little water content. So if you try to get the ice and scrunch it up like a snowball, then it would just flake away in your hands because it hasn't got anything to bind it together. So that's why you cut bricks to build an igloo, because it's more structural, a bit like polystyrene if you like. The igloos will keep you sheltered from the wind, and you can actually light a fire inside or put your cooker on, and that will then contain the heat inside. The only technical thing you need to know about is how those fumes are released outside. If it's sealed, you can actually succumb to the fumes. So, romantic spiral. Walking to work today in a stormy winter weather made me realise I have zero survival instincts. Drop me alone in the middle of the Arctic and I will give up within a day. If the average person was dropped into the same area that I operate in, it would be a rapid decrease in their mental and physical state. There is a thing called Arctic shock, and that's the reality of where you are. The coldness that engulfs you, the wind that whips around you, the realization that you're not going to be able to go into a building for the next 2 to 3 weeks can be quite intense on you. So Arctic shock kicks in, and basically that means that your body's telling you to give in at a very, very early stage. So failure would be very, very quick for them unless you have that backing of experience. So simple beauty asks, so we're not going to talk about Antarctica melting. Well, I've actually brought in some ice which is melted over the course of 12 years from Antarctica and from the Arctic Circle as well. So this is ice from the geographic North Pole, and this is ice from the geographic South Pole. In Antarctica, the ice is melting so fast, and it's one of the most rapidly heating places on the planet. So much research is being taken out there with different teams from around the world. And when it comes round to the Arctic Circle, because it's an ocean, obviously there's very, very different patterns there. But with the Arctic, it's very, very different altogether because it's an ocean with land masses around it like Russia and Canada and places like that. So you've got ice crossing all the way from Russia all the way to Canada, but that ice is depleting. And as the ice melts, the sea levels rise. But how does that work? Because in an ice cube in a glass, if the ice melts, it stays the same level. But because the ice is so vast, it's got its own gravitational pull, and it draws in water from, or oceans from around the planet, and as it gets to the top of the world it freezes, and that's why you get this beautiful ice mass on top of the planet. But because the world is heating up, this ice is melting and it's now dispersing the water back around the planet, so sea levels rise. And that's an explanation of what's happening at both poles. To the naked eye, this looks very, very clear at both poles, but in the Antarctic one, you've got ice which is sat on top of landmass. So it's pure ice sat on top of there in a pure area. And on this one, you've got ice from the ocean, the Arctic Ocean. So I would imagine it's got salt content within this one, though I haven't tested it. But they are very, very different in their content. Hetch Silence says, how do we make fire in the snow? Well, in my world, as an explorer, I don't make fires. We haven't got any trees, we've got nothing to burn. And it'd be wrong of me to burn anything out there anyway, environmentally. So what I use to heat up my food is a little cooker. We use fuel and we light that, and it sets off the heat for the food, but also heat for the tent as well. So it warms me up at the same time. And I go out and collect snow and ice, and I melt that down, boil it up, and that's what I add to my food. So actually, the heater is a main source of survival. Cora writes, what was your most unexpected Arctic experience? One of the most memorable was you expect to see a polar bear in the Arctic, but one day a little lemming just decided to walk into the tent, and it was a total shock. A lemming is a little rodent, and he just walked in like it was his home. I took some photographs and didn't touch him at all, and then he walked out, and as I saw him walk out, he sort of walked off into the ice and then just disappeared over a little bit of ice, and I thought, how does he survive in this wilderness? So those are all the questions. Thank you very much for them. It's made me think about who I am as an explorer. It's put me on my back foot. You've occasionally made me smile as well. So thanks for watching Polar Explorer Support.